Wait, stop. Sorry guys, I've got another super quick announcement before we get started. You've probably noticed some of the channel art on my page recently. That was actually done by my good friend Emily over at EJS Creations. Check out the link below to see some of her work. She's currently taking commissions, and I'm sure she'd be happy to draw something up nice for you. That's ejscreationsart.tumblr.com. Okay, now I'm done whoring myself out for my friends, I promise. How about we get started with the bullshit, eh? Whew, God damn, am I glad we got through that one alive. Seriously, I did not originally intend for that episode to be so exhaustive, but holy God, once I started writing, the words never seemed to stop coming. Perhaps I should hire an editor. Well, regardless, because of the time I needed to take making that episode, I ended up missing a lot of stuff on the new release shelves, so I figured we'd devote this quickie to playing a bit of catch-up. I picked 12 albums that I missed in the time span of making Raditude, and we're just going to spend a teensy bit of time talking about all of them. Some of these really deserve more time to be elaborated on, some don't, but we're just going to touch on them quickly, just to help save a little time. Hopefully this will be the last longish episode I'll have to put you guys through, at least for a while anyway, and we can get back to a semi-regular schedule after this. So, without further ado... You know, I made the old mistake of reading some of the reviews on this album before actually listening to it, and apparently it hasn't been getting very good marks from some people, but frankly, I am not one of them. I really enjoyed this album, and even though I'm a big fan of the old school Pixies, this album didn't disappoint me. To me, it sounds what a 28-year-old version of the Pixies would sound like. It's more mature, it's a bit less quirky, but it's no less charming and engaging than any of their other work. I will admit I do miss Kim Deal's presence on this album, but it's still very enjoyable even without her trademark low ending. No offense, Kim. I think a lot of the backlash is coming from the fact that this album doesn't really sound like a new Doolittle or Surferosa. I, for one, wasn't expecting another Doolittle. We have a Doolittle. It's a perfectly good Doolittle and we don't need another one. This album is a different flavor of Pixie Stick, but just because it's different doesn't mean it's any less sweet. Indie Cindy gets 4 trips to the dentist out of 5. Okay, maybe it's not exactly fair to review a joke band, and hell, seeing as how this was the first full album of theirs I actually bothered to listen to, maybe I'm not even the right person to be reviewing this at all, but for whatever it's worth, I did enjoy it. To a point. I mean, don't get me wrong, I knew exactly what I was getting into right from the start, with song titles like Bukkake Tears and Fucking My Heart in the Ass, how on earth could you not? But I have to give credit where it's due, these guys aren't unskilled behind their instruments, and they do a good job of capturing the spirit of 80s glam metal and butt rock. They do a pretty decent job of towing the line between paying homage to those genres and outright parodying them. And for all its crassness and immaturity, I had a decent amount of fun with it. For a little while anyway. The joke really did start to get old somewhere around "You're beautiful when you don't talk," but hell, for what it is, it's pretty good, I guess. It made me laugh for all the right reasons, something some albums on this list can't necessarily attest to, I can say that much. All You Can Eat gets 3 sex bangs out of 5. Okay, so apparently this isn't the original Fuel from something like Human and Sunburn, but at the same time, this isn't that new Fuel lineup from Angels and Demons, the one without Brett Scallions, but rather, still, this lineup is more akin to the Refueled lineup, I guess, which featured Scallions and a bunch of other guys, but it's not the same guys this time, and wow, it really speaks to how boring this album is when the only interesting thing I can talk about are all the lineup changes. This album was very underwhelming. Scallions doesn't really sound like himself anymore. That's to say, he doesn't sound like he's doing a Scott Stapp impression, so his voice sounds very flat and generic, and the instrumentation, while not the worst I've ever heard, was also very cookie-cutter and by the numbers. This album seems to have a bit more of a country influence, and it really doesn't fit them very well. Maybe if you're a huge Fuel fan, this might be worth a listen, but I was a huge Fuelie back in high school, and this album did little to rile up those nostalgic feelings. You'd probably be better off just streaming something like Human again. Puppet Strings gets 2 hemorrhages out of 5. You know, there's not much I can really say about this album. It's an off record. It sounds just like every other off record up to this point. And you know what? I do believe that that's a good thing. I really do like Off. I'm glad they exist, and I'm glad they're making this kind of music, but at the same time, I might be burning out on them just a wee bit. That's not to say that this album is lacking in any department. It's just as fast, ferocious, and intense as any of their other releases, and it does hold up when stacked beside them. But at the same time, that could also be to its detriment. Off isn't really showing us any new tricks or mixing up their formula, which, yeah, I understand that is kind of the whole point behind Off, but just to be frank, this was the first album that did start to lose me a little by the end. But that's not to say I didn't enjoy it. I still had a lot of fun with this album, and if you still love Off or you're just an old school hardcore junkie, then this is definitely worth picking up. It's certainly better than other throwback punk albums that have been released lately. Cough, cough. Wasted Years gets 3.5 Keith Morris dreadlocks out of 5. Speaking of throwbacks, here's one from the old emo days that really came out of nowhere and surprised me. Back in the heyday of Hot Topic and Fringe Cuts, I wasn't exactly the biggest TBS fan. I mean, I had a copy of Tell All Your Friends, but who the hell didn't back in 2002? I lost interest somewhere around Louder Now, and I really wasn't expecting much from these guys, but I'll be damned if this isn't one of the better albums I listened to for this compilation. You know, it reminds me a bit of Indie Cindy, not sonically obviously, but in that it sounds like a band we used to know, only with a more mature and refined spin. The album has a much more deliberate pace, and Adam Lazzara's vocals aren't nearly as squeaky and insufferable as they've sounded on previous releases. He scales back things a bit here and there, and avoids a lot of the crazier high-register stuff, and I think the album is better for it. It's nice to see a band from this era actually get better with age, and given that I don't have a ton of nostalgia for these guys, the fact that they can produce an album this good is very impressive. After listening to this, I hope they stick around long enough for us to hear more from them. Happiness Is gets 4 warm guns out of 5. Now these guys, on the other hand, I have a ton of nostalgia for. I wore the plastic off of my copy of In Love and Death, you know, back when hard formats were actually a thing. My god, I'm starting to feel old, but their latest really left me cold. To be completely transparent, I did stop paying attention to these guys sometime after they started inserting the word motherfucker into nursery rhymes, but after hearing what Taking Back Sunday could produce after all these years, I entered this album with fairly high hopes. Hopes that were so dashed after I heard a lyric from Buried Myself Alive, bold-faced copy-pasted into one of the very first tracks. Jesus, guys, really? I mean, it wasn't exactly unbearable. It's decently played, I guess, and the band does still sound like themselves, unlike other bands on the list, but it sounds like these guys are just kind of spinning their wheels at this point. The lyrics are perhaps slightly more interesting than what I've heard, but you have to understand, for the used, that's not really saying much. We're talking about a band whose biggest hit is about a dead chihuahua, for God's sake. I guess this album's kind of like Puppet Strings in that way. If you're a huge used fan, it might hit the spot for you, but those of you looking for a nostalgia trip would probably do better dusting off your copy of the eponymous album. The lyrics they lifted from it sound better on there anyway. Imaginary Enemy gets 2 dead chihuahuas out of 5. Okay, I pretty much had to cover this one. The more observant of you probably already know why, but yeah, I've been a pretty big Eels fan ever since the beginning. I've done my fair share of soul-jacking off. Lol. But this album is superb. It's a vulnerable, slow, and sad affair with lots of wonderful strings, sweeping hornwork, and elegant synths, while still retaining some of those trademark Eels qualities that loosely hold their catalog together. Seriously, E still rocks a glockenspiel with the best of them. And Everett's vocals seem to be getting raspier with age. When he hits his lower register, I swear I can almost see tinges of Tom Waits in his delivery. If Tom Waits had a hipster neckbeard and horn rims, that is. But frankly, I'm okay with that. It works here. For Eels fans, this is another must-own, and I'd even recommend it to the curious as well. Then again, I'm kind of a fanboy, so take it with a grain of salt, but E very rarely disappoints, and I say you should pick this up. Cautionary Tales gets 4.5 neckbeards out of 5. Let's move away from neckbeards though, shall we, and move on to the world of metal, which, okay, is actually just a whole different type of neckbeard, but shut up. This was another band I actually wasn't familiar with, but I caught a Metal Sucks article on them, and it sparked my interest, and I really dug what I heard. Too bad the band broke up in roughly the time it took to listen to the damn thing. Debut album released March 17th, band breaks up April 29th. That has gotta be some kind of record. And it's a shame we probably won't be hearing more from these gals too, because this was a very solid debut. This is good old classic style metal, through and through, taking many of its tones and arrangements from the late 70s genesis of metal and pulling them off without nary a hitch. If you love thrashing your way through the last Sabbath record, but haven't quite satiated your hunger for concentrated gloom, this album will make for a deliciously doomy treat. I just hope it's enough to satisfy, because the chances of getting any more from either of them at this point is highly unlikely. The Oath gets 4 black rainbows out of 5. I was very tempted to not even give this one a second glance. That is until I heard that it would be their first full release without former lead singer Josie, oh dear God, will someone buy this guy a neti pot, Scott. I never enjoyed any of Saliva's music, but Scott's nasally, phlegm-filled delivery was really a big reason why. Fitting that a band called Saliva would be fronted by a man made entirely out of snot. So I thought that maybe now that the band had a vocalist that wasn't actively trying to sing out of his nostril, I might be able to see some potential in the group. Not so, I'm afraid. If anything, I discovered that Scott's vocals were pretty much the only original thing this band had to offer, and isn't that a disquieting thought? Everything about this album is pure generic. Generic hooks, generic beats, even the new vocalist sounds like he was plucked from the bottom shelf of Walmart's nu metal vocalist style. All I can say is that it's probably the best Saliva album I've ever heard, but that's not really a compliment. It's like saying out of this particular line of recently used barf bags, this one contains the least gobbing. Rise Up gets 1 loogie out of 5. Okay, I might be moving a wee bit out of my jurisdiction for this one, but a friend asked me to check it out, so I decided to give it a spin, and for exposing me to this particular album, that friend has won herself a serious high five. The music on this album is rich, hooky, and infectiously poppy. It crawls into your brain, and those hooks and choruses stick with you for days, so I guess the title is certainly apt. It was refreshing as hell to hear a pop album that doesn't feel either washed out in oversaturation or fake dubstep wubbing, while not being so minimalistic that there's barely even anything to listen to. It hits that cushy, catchy middle ground. The beats are very heavy and danceable, the synths and lead flesh out the treble very well, and it's just overall a very solid piece of junk food pop. It isn't very nutritious, but boy, God is it tasty. For what it was, I found it curiously satisfying. If you're looking for a little guilty pleasure pop to jam out to between bursts of Black Dahlia Murder and Trivium, I definitely say give this one a look. Just, don't tell anybody about it. It'll be our little secret. Pop Psychology gets 4 guilty pleasures out of 5. And now from Guilty Pleasures, we move on to the Just Plain Guilty. I knew from square one I shouldn't have gone anywhere near this album, but when all the controversy surrounding a lovely little song called Bring a Gun to School popped up in my news feeds, I just knew I was gonna have to talk about this one. I was expecting bad. I was expecting downright horrible. What I got ended up being the single worst album I've ever reviewed for the channel. Ever. This thing is fucking Drek right down to its very core. The instrumentation exhibits virtually no skill. Not that it matters, because the mix is so goddamn dissident you wouldn't be able to make out a decent lick, even if there was one to be found. I'm half convinced they're playing their instruments by banging them against their crotches. And the lyrics? Oh! Okay, as a metalhead, I've been known to enjoy some pretty gruesome stuff. I can definitely handle a good shock. But even though I'm sure these lyrics were intended to shock, they don't. They're just insipid. It's a collection of stupid, empty threats mouthed off by some sniveling little twerp. The Satanist had shocking lyrics. This bullshit is just the equivalent of the school bully, pushing you up against the locker and calling you a f***. No, literally. This music is not angry, it's just rambling and cantankerous, and it was clearly written by someone who has never experienced any real problems. What the hell would you even call that? Privilege core? Bullshit core? How about first world core? Hashtag drama. Don't buy this album. Don't stream this album. Don't even look at this album if it hoves in your general field of vision. It's a spoiled kid screaming his head off in the middle of a department store because mommy wouldn't buy him a candy bar. It wants attention. It doesn't deserve it. Eternal Enemies gets 0.5 embarrassed parents out of 5. But thankfully, we don't have to end this Mega-sode on such a sour note. Let's get to the coup de grace, and brother, what a coup de grace it is. If you didn't happen to pick up the Menzinger's previous album, On the Impossible Past, shame on you, go fix that immediately. But if you did, this album will still feel very familiar. The Menzingers have always been a band of earnestness and outstanding storytelling, and the tradition continues here. The lyrics ache with tales of tragedy, love, and regret, and Greg Barnett and Tom May's strained, raspy vocals convey those tales exquisitely. This band has somehow perfected the art of marrying soaring, anthemic choruses with wailing punk guitar thrash and screeching vocal deliveries into lyrics that can both touch your soul and tug at your heartstrings. It's like slamming in the mosh pit while at the same time a single tear solemnly runs down your face. It's mind-boggling how they pull this shit off. I really wish I could go into further detail, but I'm running short on time as it is, so I'll finish with this. If you like earnest, soulful punk music in the vein of Against Me, Hot Water Music, or even Rise Against and Bouncing Souls, you definitely need to check this one out. It is definitely Album of the Year material, and yeah, don't be surprised if it ends up on the list. Wink, wink. Rented World gets 5 winks out of 5.